Welcome back to a guide to classic Thomas. This is the video series where I go over one season or movie of Thomas the Tank Engine at a time, review each and every episode, and even pick between all the different narrators. Now we're taking a look at the second season, which aired 2 years following season 1 in 1986. The same crew and team were all working on this, and as you'd expect, the show could only go up. More characters and more stories based on the Runaway series. And you'd be right. We're in for a wonderful season. Like last time, if you want to skip to me doing a particular review of a particular episode, the links are down in the description below. Thomas, Percy, and the Coal, or Double Trouble. Imagine being a kid and seeing this opening. You're excited as it's been 2 years, and it starts with these amazing new sets, the wonderful music, and Thomas rushes by to then meet Percy and Toby. This episode continues Thomas's character arc of him being cheeky and rather rude at times. Taking a page out of James's book, he says his blue paintwork is for really useful engines, and insults his two best friends in the process. Then after an accident, him and Percy start getting cross with each other. The episode is a fairly basic best friends fighting story, but we hadn't seen much of that before in Thomas and Percy's relationship. So it was an interesting turn that made the two's friendship more relatable and real. We didn't see them together often in season 1, and throughout this season we will see the twists and turns they take. The only downside to this episode is that it's wrapped up pretty quickly. The episode was based on the first story of Christopher Awdry's book, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. And since the episodes are spread throughout the season and the final story wasn't concluded, they had to wrap this one up quickly. It works okay. It's still a great story turn to flesh out more of Thomas and Percy's friendship and bringing your favorites back immediately for season 2. The music is as great as ever, adding some nice new bits. And you can definitely tell the production of the sets has taken a step up in both design and effects. They weren't afraid to cover the Thomas model in coal. For narrators, I listened to all 3 dubs, and Ringo Starr definitely got this episode. George Carlin does fine with his usual nice voice.
Oh, I don't know. I like my brown paint. Toby thought it a great joke, but Percy was cross with Thomas for thinking he had made his paint dirty on purpose.
But Ringo Starr definitely came alive this episode.
Hello, Thomas, whistled Percy. You look splendid. Well, anyway, huff, Thomas. Blue is the only colour for a really useful engine. The last load poured down. Help! I'm choking! Cried Thomas. Get me out! Help! Help!
I considered his US dub too, but it still has the problem of lines sounding out of sync. Cows, or a cow on the line. How perfect to have the next episode of the season focus on the favorite character, Edward. And the new version of his theme is especially welcome. These next few stories follow the Railway series book on Edward, so throughout his stories we see Edward's valiance put to the test, and we even discover he's not a perfect character. He has moments where things get to him, though in this case it was Gordon taunting him. I like that Toby, a fellow old engine, took his side to defend him against Gordon. Then, when a cow is discovered blocking the line, I like that the situation is treated seriously by the station as a small emergency. Then, Gordon got what was coming to him. In narration, Ringo Starr is keeping his oomph levels up, but unfortunately something about it doesn't really work here. That's the only variation in his lines, and he doesn't go soft in the right places. His dubs come off as rather shouty, and it just doesn't sound great. George Carlin, as I've said before, has a more soothing voice compared to Ringo Starr, and it is much better here. In addition, George varies the type of emotion he gives, not just by making his voice louder.
His bearings were worn and he clanked as he puffed along. You couldn't help it, Edward. They've never met cows. I have, and I know the trouble they are. Whoa, Gordon! She had lost her calf and felt lonely. That must be Bluebell, said the porter. Her calf is here, looking for her mother. Percy will take her along.
And his variety of voices is here as always, too.
Fancy allowing cows to break your train. Shoo! Shoo! Afraid? Rubbish!
He absolutely did the narration better this time. Bertie's chase. I like this one quite a bit. Continuing Edward's saga, we see a couple more of his character flaws, but he is always his kind-hearted self and didn't mean any harm. I especially like that the chase itself can be thought of as a spiritual successor to Thomas and Bertie's race, up until they fully brought it back later. This episode is just as exciting as that race. You really hope they catch Edward, and they have to keep catching him as they just barely miss him every time. It's great to see plenty of new sets in the chase, and the music is fantastic. Both using the Bertie theme from Thomas and Bertie and new version of that theme that would be used again in Thomas Gets Bumped. Both complement the exciting feel of the episode beautifully. For narration, I didn't figure it out until Percy and the Signal, but there isn't a Ringo US dub for this one. Season 1 mostly has redubs, but it turns out Ringo didn't redub every episode of Season 1 and 2. Whistles and Sneezes didn't have a US dub, and neither does this episode. So I'll compare the other two. In that regard, Ringo Starr's excitement seems to suit the chase better.
Bother Thomas's fireman not coming to work today. Hooray, hooray, I see him. Wait, wait, cried Bertie. My fault, replied Bertie. Late at junction. You didn't know about Thomas's passengers?
There are some lines that both George and Ringo do evenly well.
Stop! Stop! I've got Thomas's passengers, wailed Bertie, roaring up to the gates. It was no good. Edward was gone.
And George got the song better.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Sang the fireman. Johnny's so long, and never you mind about Johnny, laughed the driver.
But Ringo Starr still won this episode over. Save from scrap. After a nice introduction, Edward is off to the scrapyard.
What? Already? You're not that old.
Though as you'd expect, Edward doesn't mind that joke. He's off to take some scrap from the yard to the steelworks. I like that this situation is treated seriously. Trevor is clearly scared and desperate as he knows if he's polished he'll be fine, but his owner won't listen. So Edward is panickingly trying to think of someone who can buy him. Then he finds the perfect person to do it, and he does rescue Trevor, who now has a happy new home. It's a pretty good story. The scrapyard set is good, and as always, Mike and Jr. have a great new theme for Trevor. For narrators, Ringo Starr does his usual, but there's nothing he tops George with. And George takes the cake.
Where?
With his voices for Trevor, the Vicar, and Jim Cole.
My driver says I only need some paint, polish, and oil to be as good as new, but my owner says I'm old-fashioned. What's the matter, Charlie? The Reverend is coming to see you, Trevor. Maybe he'll buy you.
Old Iron. This episode was one of my childhood favorites, and still is. One reason I loved it so much was because it was on a tape that I had that I didn't watch much because I didn't know it was on there. I did know it was on the Best of James DVD, which I'd rent from the library, but only for a day, so it felt like a special treat whenever I got to watch it. And there's something about it I still just love. It could be the nice character story with Edward and James somewhat feuding in the beginning, reconciling, and being happy for each other in the end. It could be just how serious the situation of James being a runaway is treated with the signal slamming up and an inspector being sent. And then it pays off wonderfully with the masterfully done chase sequence. The inspector is standing out dangerously on the open trying to snatch James's buffer, and the runaway theme perfectly fits the sequence. It's one I still love to this day. The narration is another case like Percy Runs Away of some showcasing one line Ringo did better whilst the rest of the episode George tops him.
What shall I do? I can't stop. Help! Help! We're coming, called Edward.
That is a bit better than George's version, but George got the rest of the episode. He has his Sir Topham Hatt voice, his James voice.
Late again!
Late again?
He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow, he makes us wait.
He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow he makes us wait.
He did this line much better.
All traffic halted.
And the biggest part of the episode was the chase. But aside from that one line, George did it better.
Edward was panting up behind with every ounce of steam he had. At last, he caught up with James.
Case in point, this line.
The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope and the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer.
The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope in the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer.
Ringo sounds like he's reading off information, whereas George is reading that line a little faster and makes the scene feel properly intense. Thomas and Trevor, or a new friend for Thomas. Here we have a continuation of Trevor's story. He gets some new work to do and meets Thomas. This also starts the Wharf Project, which continues through Season 2. It's an interesting dynamic with Thomas and Trevor, as Thomas is confused by him and somewhat skeptical. But he sees how good Trevor can be at his job and tries to make him happy. Something that confused me even when I watched this as a kid was, if Thomas is supposed to be puzzled or skeptical about Trevor, why does he have the same face mask on this whole episode? A little lazy. And the very last shot of the episode brings back childhood memories. This was a nice episode. Not that great, but nice. Deciding between narrators was somewhat difficult because Ringo putting more volume into his words paid off in some lines.
Thomas eyed the newcomer doubtfully. "A what engine?" he asked, but he was still puzzled.
But George's more soothing voice paid off sometimes, like here.
Now I understand how useful a traction engine can be.
And at the nice quiet ending sequence. And he definitely still has the distinct Trevor voice perfectly tuned. I guess that tips the balance to him. Percy and the Signal. Here's a pretty good Percy episode. A fun tale about him being cheeky, much like Thomas pulling jokes back at the start of the series. He gets the better of Gordon and James, and they get the better of him. This episode can be thought of as the Percy version of Thomas Gets Tricked, though Gordon's payback is less cruel and more funny. The whole episode has that tone of amusing fun. Upper still must mean go back. And then he's caught in the act. Like Season 1, there's something about the episode that's just classic. I like it a lot. In narration, both Ringo and George are evenly matched in emotion.
"Show a wheel, James. You can't stay here all day." "Oh," said James. "Oh, where's Percy?"
Stop! You're going the wrong way!
But George's voices again steal the show.
Ha 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 ha! Sir Topham Hatt told me to stay here. He sent a message this morning. James and I were just speaking about signals at the junction.
Duck takes charge. Here we see Percy, who took Thomas's shunting job that he had in Season 1, and now it's passed on to Duck while Percy goes to the Wharf Project. And here's the introduction of the last of the 8 famous engines, Duck, who's welcomed with another lovely Mike and Junior theme. Since Duck's character came under fire a lot in the past few years, and I even took a shot at that, I'll just give a neutral assessment of his character here. Duck isn't a super interesting type. He's another typical Audrey character. Hardworking, brave, proud of his heritage, and stands no nonsense. He has similar traits to Edward, Toby, and others. But when you circle Audrey's main 8 together, they do all have characteristics that run into each other. Which is why I say another typical Audrey character. Not strong enough to hold a one-man play like some of the others, but there's plenty to do with him if you write good stories around him, as we'll see in a few episodes. And this first one isn't bad. Duck finds he really should have kept the name Montague and is mocked pretty heavily. So he and Percy go up against the big engines and protest. It's pretty satisfying to see, especially when Sir Topham Hatt sticks it to the big engines. The narration this time was interesting. Most of the time in this episode, Ringo does just fine with emotion, as he has been better this whole season, though not every line was perfect.
"Rubbish," said James. "Any engine could do it." Whee! Whee!
Also, if this is just his voice, he has a neat talent. The confrontation scene had some great moments for him in both of his dubs.
"Stop that noise! Silence!" snapped the fat controller. "Quiet!" called Sir Topham Hatt.
But George, I can't deny, matched those moments with some great voice work himself.
Quack! 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 Wheesh! Stop that noise! Quiet! Said Sir Topham Hatt.
And in addition to emotion, his range of voices trumps again.
Do you know what? Silly, said Gordon. Of course I don't know what. If you don't tell me what is. Rubbish, said James. Any engine could do it. I don't know if I'm standing on my dome or on my wheels. You've been worse.
Even for Duck.
Montague, sir, but I'm usually called Duck.
That didn't last through the season, but it's still a very good narration. Percy and Harold, or Percy Proves a Point. This is another excellent fun episode. Percy working on the wharf meets Harold the helicopter. It's great to get introduced to another iconic character and introduce the classic rivalry between him and Percy that lasts for a while. I also have to take a second here and say of all the classic series themes, I love Harold's. It's one of my favorites. Just listen to the way it builds and how grand it is.
They're not much use and quite out of date. He whirled his arms and buzzed away.
The episode also continues the saga of another fun race. Percy flying along with the troublesome trucks humorously grumbling, and the music here is fantastic too. I also really admire this one shot they did of the race from Harold's perspective. You see Percy curve through the tracks and fields. The production is definitely up since last season, and this was a new bold direction to try. It was probably a pain to get this shot right. And the race comes to a close with Percy thinking they've lost, but Harold still needs to park. I definitely love this one. In narration, Ringo did a few lines better in the UK.
I say, Toby, that Harold, that stuck-up whirlybird thing, says I'm slow and out of date. Percy, whispered his driver, there's Harold.
And he did some not as good as George, including the song and these.
You're gaining! Well done, Percy, shouted the driver.
Interestingly, Ringo's US dubs were getting better by this point. Aside from the song, none of the new lines sound out of place, and some are good improvements.
He collected his freight cars and started off, still fuming. Hurry, 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 he panted to the cars.
So I guess if you're going to listen to a Ringo dub of this episode, go with the US one, as it just adds more to the UK one. But George again had plenty of lines he did better.
Well, I'll be a ding-dong-dang, said the driver. We don't want to, they grumbled. We've won, he shouted.
And the song, too. But the biggest thing for me is his Percy and Harold voices. Ringo's voice for Harold is just speaking a little faster. But George did a really good one here.
I'm Harold. Who are you?
And the whole episode he does a really good job at making this feel exciting. The Runaway. This story in the books directly follows Thomas, Percy, and Nicole as the next part of More About Thomas the Tank Engine. Of the few Chris Awdry stories that were adapted into TV series episodes, this one I think is the best. Since it was meant to take place after the coal episode, Thomas gets sick from the coal in his system and has to go to the works. When he returns, his handbrake is so stiff, Thomas keeps stopping too late. And the day Thomas has a replacement fireman is the day his brakes are off and he runs down the line uncontrollably. A serious chase ensues, and continuing from last episode, Harold takes an inspector to stop the runaway. The magnificent Harold theme is here again, and it's extended. I love this moment when the inspector comes to rescue Thomas. The Harold theme is perfectly placed, Thomas is tired and running through the platform slowly, and just at the right moment the inspector gets in and stops Thomas. Christopher Awdry's stories have a reputation of being so full of technical details on how the engine's mechanics work that the stories and characters are boring. This one I think is interesting, and the episode's adventurous direction only adds to a good story to make it great. The narrations aren't too different, as a good chunk of this episode didn't have lines that needed to be said loudly. The story is captivating enough. It's not really action, it's adventure. In that regard, I don't understand why Ringo overdid this line.
As a result, he and his coaches often overran the platform. Thomas found this most embarrassing.
When Thomas took off, that was appropriate.
He tried to stop, but he couldn't without his driver and fireman. He tried to whistle a warning, but he couldn't do that either.
But if you listen to George's version of that bit, yeah, he isn't shouting, but you can tell he's treating the situation seriously. He captures the emotion more naturally. I'll say that the two lines Ringo redid in his US dub were well-integrated improvements. so Ringo's US dub is superior to his UK. But since most of the episode is listening to both narrators at their average tone, George's voice is still more human.
Such nice manners, they told each other.
Listen to this final scene after Thomas has been stopped and tell me who sounds more relieved.
Judging his moment, the inspector scrambled into the cab and screwed the brake hard on. At last, Thomas stopped.
Judging his moment, the inspector scrambled into the cab and screwed the brakes on. At last, Thomas stopped.
Yep, Percy takes the plunge. Here in this episode, we see Percy has a bit of an ego. The story is rather similar to Down the Mine, and the comparison is intentional. Thomas even warns Percy about what happened to him then, but he doesn't listen. This is also another story of the troublesome trucks wreaking havoc, and having Percy crash into the water is an interesting one to do. Production is improved. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be the completed wharf or somewhere else, but it's a really cool set, especially all the boats. This episode is a little cliche, but it's still pretty good. Narrations on both sides were average at first. George was doing his usual nice voice, Ringo was doing his usual. Both of them missed Percy's little song.
Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain.
Neither really topped the other. Until we got to the crash scene, Ringo definitely did that better.
"Oh!" said Percy, sliding past the board. Percy was frantic. "That's enough!"
Even as a kid, when I thought George's dub was all there was, it didn't sound right here.
"Ow!" said Percy, sliding past the board. Percy was frantic. "That's enough!"
Then I watched the UK dub over again, and I realized there are some scenes that probably sound mildly better with Ringo.
Danger!
They were such small moments I didn't even notice them at first. For Ringo's US dub, sadly, the problem has returned that the added lines don't match the rest.
Then I'll make them stop. I can do that whenever I like. Every wise engine knows that you cannot trust freight cars.
George Carlin has the voice of Sir Topham Hatt better and Bill and Ben, but none of them are a part of this episode very long. The crash being the focal point of this episode won it. Pop goes the Diesel. This episode is a great staple of history. It's when we meet Diesel, who comes with another great music theme. Him and Duck go up against each other. Duck at the time is being a bit stuck up and preaching about his railway, the Great Western. When Diesel comes along boasting about being a revolutionary diesel, with a similar personality trait, him and Duck of course clash. Diesel tries to flatter the others by teasing their egos, but Duck sees right through that nonsense. The two have similar personality traits, but Diesel is much more arrogant compared to Duck. He thinks he is perfect. Duck may be proud of his heritage, but he is morally good and strong. Diesel thinks being exemplary is the pure reason he exists, and underneath, he is a lying manipulator. Duck puts him to work on a line of trucks, but he grabs the line that is too stiff to move at all. At one point, he pulls so hard on the line their brakes snap and he flies forward. Hence the title, Pop Goes the Diesel. Duck, just eating up Diesel's failure, heads out while Diesel has to clean up. The engine that knows everything humiliates himself in the richest of ways. He didn't anticipate it, but Sodor already has trucks full of themselves who will put others down like he does. To see him get what he so deserved is great. They even put it into a super funny song. This is a super fun and satisfying story on its own and leads into some more great ones. Narration this time was really well matched. Both George and Ringo gave Diesel a distinct voice.
Good morning, Per Diesel in an oily voice.
Good morning, Per Diesel in an oily voice. We are revolutionary.
We are revolutionary.
Both do good with enthusiasm.
Pull, push, backwards, forwards.
Pull, push, backwards, forwards.
Chuckled Duck.
Chuckled Duck.
Both growl. Ringo doesn't do as well with this.
We can't. We won't.
But that's one line. I think this one is a tie. The deciding factor is probably which version of the titular song you prefer, though in that regard, don't go for Ringo's US dub. I honestly would have liked it best if the truck sang solo. Dirty Work, or Diesel's Devious Deed. Continuing Diesel's story, we find he blames Duck for what happened and wants him out. So after finding the engines consider gossiping to trucks a very heinous thing to do, he does so and plants the evidence on Duck. Then when Duck comes in after work and the three big engines bar him, Sir Topham Hatt finds out. Diesel's plan works and Duck gets in trouble. It's a sad cliffhanger to see Duck down at the dumps because of trickery. The episode is also another great showcase of Diesel's character, showing just how petty and how much of a liar he is. It's another great story. Both narrators have their Diesel voice again, and Ringo has a couple lines that top George.
Shut up, he ordered.
But he has some that don't work as well.
He did it to us. We'll do it to him and see how he likes it. Hoosh! I'm old Square Wheels, fumed, Henry. Certainly not, sir. No steam engine would be as mean as that.
George has the Diesel voice, troublesome trucks.
Guffawed the cars. Gordon will be cross with Duck when he knows.
The Gordon voice, James's voice, Sir Topham Hatt's voice, and he gets the emotion down just fine. And in places better than Ringo.
I don't. You do. I don't. You do. Duck called me a galloping sausage, spluttered Gordon. Rusty red scrap iron. Certainly not, sir. No steam engine would be as mean as that.
George had a little more this time. A close shave. Or a close shave for Duck. When I was a kid, my first introduction to this episode was this scene on a DVD bonus feature.
It's too late, Duck groaned. He veered into a siding where a barber had set up shop. He was shaving a customer.
This was long before I had seen the whole of the classic series, or even the first two parts of the Duck and Diesel story, and I was very interested in whatever epic story this was. It caught my attention. When I saw it fully, this became one of my favorite episodes, and I still really like it. Duck goes to Edward, the last one who still believes in Duck. They just go to work and share each other's company. Then, the troublesome trucks strike again and chase Duck across the main line, crashing him into a barber shop of all places. The chase sequence is really well done, and seeing the barber waste a ton of shaving cream to smother Duck is pretty funny. Then he is rescued, and it turns out Diesel has been found out. Duck and Diesel may have a similar character trait, but Diesel proved to Sir Topham Hatt he was a liar, and Duck proved he is a hero. It's a really exciting episode and a good end to the Diesel trilogy. I'd recommend watching this one with the US Ringo Starr dub. George does fine with voices for Sir Topham Hatt and the barber.
I do not like engines popping through my walls, fumed the barber.
But Ringo far outshines him with the chase sequence.
Hurry, Duck, hurry, said the driver. They raced through Edward Station, but the cars were catching up.
George played that bit rather ominously, and Ringo definitely captured the action part of it. His UK dub was fine, but the US lines done over make it even more exciting. And there are a couple other good moments Ringo topped George in.
Beg pardon, sir, gasped Duck. It was a very close, shave.
Better late than never. Here again is another story from Chris Awdry's book, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. This one is just a simple story about being late due to the viaduct being repaired. We do get to see more of Thomas's character being a jerk, who's so fed up with being late he said he wouldn't care if the bridge collapsed if it meant he could be on time. Of course, when Bertie breaks down, we see Thomas turn around and help both the passengers and his friend. It was lucky both him and Bertie were late. Not bad. Ringo has a couple lines that are superior.
Thomas grew crosser and crosser. I'm sorry, Thomas, he puffed. I was held up at the station, and the viaduct made it worse.
And the two in his US dub are improvements.
They dither about on the viaduct and then blame Sir Topham Hatt's workmen.
But he has some scenes that feel stale.
Late again, he remarked. I feel dreadful, moaned Bertie.
George matches the emotion of the angry scenes just as well.
Rubbish! He hissed fiercely. It's those main line engines. They dither about on the viaduct, and they blame Sir Topham Hatt's workmen.
And in the Bertie scenes, his nice voice does better.
I feel dreadful, moaned Bertie. Of course, agreed Thomas. He now felt sorry for Bertie and promised to get help at the next station.
Those help the episode's ending feel nicer. Brake Van, or Donald and Douglas. Here was our introduction with another great new music theme to the Scots Donald and Douglas. The story is about how since one wasn't supposed to come, Sir Topham Hatt is seeing which one does the job better and will send the other away. The twins are under a lot of pressure to try and impress him, but they're very scared since they keep messing up. This season was also meant to feature an episode set right before this one called The Missing Coach, which would have been the introduction of the twins and feature a story about Douglas messing up really badly and Sir Topham Hatt catching him in the act. It was pulled from the season because the story was deemed too complicated for kids. I think it would have provided some more build-up for this story to seem more anxious, but this still works really well on its own. You do feel sorry for the twins. You get to know them as characters, and you care about what's going to happen to them next episode. I also love the second part of the episode with James and the spiteful brake van, with Douglas trying his best to help, and an accident happens. The black eye on the smashed brake van's face is rather... whoa. The cliffhanger is a good spot to leave it on. In narration, Ringo does just fine here, but this has to be one of George's best, and Ringo can't compete. Possibly George's best voice ever was that for the twins.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I be wanting.
Where Ringo does a shouting Donald here, it's still just his regular voice.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I'd be wanting.
The twins are the focus of the episode. In addition, George has his James voice.
Shut up, said James. It's not funny.
His Sir Topham Hatt voice.
I should think so, too. You have upset my arrangements.
And he gave the spiteful brake van a distinct voice.
James is cross, snickered the spiteful brake van. We'll try to make him crosser still.
I also think this line is rather pivotal.
Help me up the hill, please, panted James. These freight cars are playing tricks.
Help me up the hill, please, panted James. These trucks are playing tricks.
George gives James a lot more emotion that he needs help desperately, whereas Ringo is asking, can you do me a favor? Ringo did okay through this episode, but George in general just had better moments.
His trains were late, and he was blamed. James won't like that. I really don't know.
The Deputation. This episode follows up the last about Donald and Douglas's fears they'll be sent away, to scrap. On some very lovely snow sets, they rescue Henry from a drift. Then when they worry about Sir Topham Hatt returning and sending them away, the engines all talk about it. They point out there's no reason to send either away to scrap for a couple accidents, when all the engines already here are definitely not accident-free. So everyone from Gordon to Duck all unite in finding a way to change things. When Edward gives Percy the idea of a deputation, it's rather funny watching him be so confident about having one, then scared off his wheels to be one. Percy's timid, childish side is hilarious in this conversation. Then at last, the twins are told by Sir Topham Hatt they're staying. Of course, we can tell Percy didn't really change his mind, or even knowing that all the other engines were united behind the deputation. It was hearing about how Donald and Douglas could indeed be heroic, like Douglas had tried to be before. That finally changed his mind. They weren't accident causers, they were part of the family. The narrations were a little more closely matched this time. Ringo had good moments like,
He'll send us back for sure. Does this mean that the both of us...
and some bad moments.
Did you say tell the fat controller?
Did you say tell Sir Topham Hatt?
George still has the voices for Donald and Douglas, Gordon, James, Percy, and Sir Topham Hatt. As usual, he's able to give great emotion and a distinct voice simultaneously.
Don't worry yourself, Henry. Wait a while. We'll have you out. That spiteful brake van, too. I propose, said Gordon, that Percy be our disputation. Me? Squeaked Percy. I can't. I had a deputation. I understand your feelings, and I've given a lot of thought to the matter.
And the centerpiece of the episode is Percy's freakout. Ringo does a pretty good job on it, but George makes Percy sound more nervous.
They say, sir, that if you send them away, sir, they'll be turned into scrap, sir.
They say, sir, that if you send them away, sir, well, they'll be turned into scrap, sir.
Thomas comes to breakfast. This episode, bringing us back to our main character, starts off with a really nice intro with the windmill and Thomas's classic theme. After a smooth run, Thomas's driver makes a joke that Thomas can somehow stop without him. And here we see more of Thomas's character. He becomes conceited that he's really awesome. When bragging about it, his friends try to stop him, but he brushes them off. Next morning, the firelighter comes and starts Thomas up. What he didn't count on was a sloppy cleaner during the night set the controls to go, and when the fire is lit, Thomas starts. I gotta say, this is one of the best build-ups for a crash I remember from Thomas. You see it just go from a confusion why he isn't stopping, to a worrisome problem, to imminent catastrophe. Crashing into a building at first doesn't seem like that big of a crash compared to some others this series has done, but they show you from inside how much he wrecked the house. This is disastrous. Imagine if a huge engine smashed into your kitchen. I'd be scared. And then imagine for some reason Mom is more angry that breakfast is ruined rather than half her house is smashed. Another funny human moment in this episode. Anybody notice right after Thomas starts, the firelighter disappears? I guess he saw what was happening and booked it so no one would see him. I really like how it seems they built a rather large Thomas that was not only in scale with the human figures, but much larger. And that face. You see how crushed Thomas is. That ego he had before is shattered, and he hardly cares when plaster falls on him, as he knows he is in serious, serious trouble. I also like how everyone from the railway comes to help rescue Thomas and the house. And the cliffhanger definitely shows consequences come when situations aren't treated seriously. This episode wasn't my favorite when I was younger, but rewatching it now, it's a great Thomas story with some fantastic production values. The narration from Ringo was fine and had good moments.
Don't be so daft, snorted Percy. I know, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Thomas's voice was muffled behind his bush.
But throughout most of the episode, he was definitely being topped by George. For example, the driver voice.
You know just where to stop, Thomas, laughed his driver.
And others.
I'm not scared. You'd never dare.
I'm not scared. You'd never dare.
That'll make them jump.
That'll make them jump.
This one line before the crash was done great by Ringo and missed by George.
Horrors! Cried Thomas.
Horrors! Cried Thomas.
But for the rest of the sequence, it's the other way around.
The station master was about to have breakfast.
The station master was about to have breakfast.
The house rocked, broken glass tinkled, plaster was everywhere.
The house rocked, broken glass tinkled, plaster was everywhere.
He tried to wheesh.
He tried to wheesh.
I just don't like the way Ringo does the wheesh. It sounds less like a rushing wind of steam and more like a kid on a slide. George also does great voices with simultaneous emotion, like Douglas, Sir Topham Hatt, and the station master's wife.
You miserable engine, she scolded. Just look what you've done to our breakfast. Now I shall have to cook some more.
Ringo did all three of those fine, but he can't compete. Daisy. This episode is one I didn't have until I got the Daisy VHS from a friend. And the cover got me very interested in this new character. When I started it, I thought her design was very unique, the face mask was very detailed, and the music is a very cool piece. Different from a lot of the others, but very well done. Percy and Toby at first are nervous about meeting this Diseasel who's replacing Thomas, but they try and be friendly, until they see what she's like. The whole episode is basically a character study of her, and it's very good as her character is extremely memorable. Like the other Diesels the engines were used to at that time, she was full of herself. But in addition, she was lazy, stubborn, disobedient, and excuse-making. The episode is just so fun to watch this ridiculously egocentric character offend and argue with everyone. And it pays off really well in following stories. Between narrators, both Ringo and George are putting emotion into it. The trouble is, Ringo doesn't have any distinct voices, which is especially a drawback for Daisy.
This is dreadfully smelly. I'm highly sprung.
This is dreadfully smelly. I'm highly sprung.
Look at me, she purred to the passengers. I'm the latest Diesel, highly sprung and right up to date.
Look at me, she purred to the passengers. I'm the latest Diesel, highly sprung and right up to date.
George has a voice for Daisy, Sir Topham Hatt, and even the crew.
Nonsense, said her driver. Come on now, back down. Stuff and nonsense, said the station master.
He also gets emotion on some of the lines better.
Will she go, sir, when Thomas comes back, sir?
Please, sir, will she go when Thomas comes back, sir?
Stop arguing, grumbled the passengers. We're late already.
Stop arguing, grumbled the passengers. We're late already.
Percy's Predicament. Continuing Daisy's saga, it's another frustrating day of Percy dealing with her leaving behind her jobs. He's probably argued with Daisy himself and gotten heated. Like Thomas, Percy has an ego which no doubt has been built up defensively against Daisy. So when he gets the job of taking Toby's trucks, he bumps them around. Unwise choice. The Runaway sequence and especially the crash are great. It's a classic troublesome trucks causing trouble story. Then when Sir Topham Hatt comes, it's nice to see Daisy finally get it handed to her how good for nothing she was being. But she did get a second chance, and she thankfully shapes up. In later seasons, Daisy returns, and many more stories about her were crafted. In them, although they're using tropes from this arc, you can tell she isn't as bad as she was here. That's some nice character development showing us she did improve. Speaking of which, everyone in this episode is in character, and they all come together nicely to conclude this story arc. All the music works really well too, especially at Thomas's return. For narration, there were little moments here and there where Ringo made a line noticeably good.
But before he could check them, the truck surged forward. Our Toby's an experienced engine.
But those are just a few. George tops Ringo in emotion, especially during his voices for Percy, Sir Topham Hatt, and everyone else.
Brakes, conductor, please. I'll have to make a special journey with it, I suppose. Pay Percy back. You have put us in an awkward predicament, Percy.
Also, Ringo does pretty good with the crash, but my goodness, this has to be George's best narrated crash ever.
Frantically trying to grip the rails, Percy slid into the yard. Peep, peep! Look out!
Frantically trying to grip the rails, Percy slid into the yard. Beep! Beep! Look out!
George's Percy is an outright terror. That's fantastic. The Diseasel. An introduction to great classic characters Bill and Ben and Boko, and this origin story for all three is really great. After seeing what the twins do, they are puzzled by the missing trucks and have a theory a Diseasel took them. That line in and of itself is really funny. It's obvious that these two don't really know what diesels are, so they think it's a magical truck-stealing parasite. The plot of this episode is really fun, seeing their plan to trick the Diesel and how they go about it to the point where they almost drive Boko loony. I love that Boko asked if there were two of them, because for a second he needed confirmation he wasn't seeing things. The music in this episode is perfect. With a really catchy bouncy theme for Bill and Ben, a good foreboding note right as they're rolling up to Boko, and some especially fun music for when they're pulling the prank. I also like that the twins find out Boko isn't a thief or scary, he's actually a nice guy. If they had made him another arrogant, rude Diesel who looked at steam engines as inferior for the third time in a row, that would have been repetitive. It shows you right away Diesels can be just as nice, and Boko as a mentor to the twins takes on great character for himself later. Ringo's narration is very good in this episode, with a lot of emotion in the right places, but George is fierce competition with his iconic Bill and Ben voice that does great with emotion too, and suits the funny nature of the episode better.
Coughs and sneezels spread diseasels.
Coughs and sneezels spread diseasels.
We're not playing protested Bill. "We're rescuing our truck," squeaked Ben.
We're not playing, protested Bill. We're rescuing our cars, squeaked Ben.
I also like Boko's voice by George better. While George is deliberately downplaying him a lot, I think it gives off the feeling that Boko can scare with just the slightest of words.
"Do you mind?"
Do you mind?
"Stop! You're making me giddy!"
Stop, you're making me giddy.
Boko chuckled. "Maddening," he said, "is the word."
Maddening, he said, is the word.
Wrong Road. This episode is a really good story, and I love its atmosphere. After a great setup shot of Thomas and Edward's branches with lovely music, we start off with Gordon bad-mouthing Boko and branch lines. Then at the station, Gordon's train sets off mistakenly, and after he returns, Edward sets off in his place. I love the atmosphere the episode has, not only from the music, but also from the many night shots. It all just has something about it I really like. Then Gordon gets what's coming to him when Bill and Ben play a pretty funny joke on him that he somehow falls for. Boko as a mentor to the twins sets them straight, and Gordon admires him now. I can't explain what it is about it I like, but something from Gordon's story to the night shots to the music just makes me love this episode a lot. In narration, there's only one particular line in this episode Ringo excels with emotion above George with.
"And arrive cold and cross."
One interesting difference is that the US version is missing one of the music tracks during the scene where Edward and Gordon are waiting at the station, but these are very minor points. So it all comes down to voices. Ringo Starr's slight Gordon voice is well pronounced here.
"It's not fair."
And like last episode, he does put great emotion into Bill and Ben.
"It looks like Gordon, but it can't be. Gordon never comes on the branch lines."
But with both Gordon and the twins, George still upstages him with better voices and more emotion in those voices.
"I won't pull Boko's dirty trucks."
I won't pull Boko's dirty cars. No, Bill, this lot's useless for scrap. We'll take it to the harbor and dump it in the sea.
Edward's exploit. This concludes the mainline engine's story plotline, and it's a wonderful episode for Edward. Before that, I must mention I love the scenery in this episode. The set in this one-shot I quite admire, and I'm not sure if it was in anything else. Edward's character is put to the test in this story, showing he is old, worn out, and some even think he should be put out of service. But characters like Duck and Boko know Edward is more valiant than any of the others. He starts the train and has a great day, but on the way back, circumstances get more and more intense. You hear ominous thunder as Edward heads home. Edward's journey is a powerful moment. Everything from the shrieking crack to Edward's kind crew helping as much as they could works here. When he at last sets off, you know the old dog faced his greatest challenge and won, because though he is old on the outside, who he is inside will not be defeated. Edward is truly a character who wouldn't complain about how hard it is or give up and ask for a bus. He selflessly just cares about getting the passengers home. And then it feels so satisfying to hear Edward was battered, weary, but unbeaten, and he made it. The old dog never gave up. Even after how late they were, the passengers were grateful for Edward's heroism and finally getting them home. It's an absolutely wonderful moment for Edward's character, most especially the moment when he starts the train after it was stuck. He had tried before and couldn't do it. And then maybe it can be done. And he's got it. With the masterfully redone version of Edward's theme, all the tension, and Edward's valiance, the emotion pulls at me every time. That grand scene sticks with me stronger than anything else in the entire franchise. This episode is the pinnacle shining moment for Edward. I won't do a top 10 Thomas episodes video, as the lists of the end of each of these videos are good enough for each season, but I must say this is my favorite episode of the entire series. Edward is the best character of the franchise, and this is his greatest, most defining moment. Of all the many reasons we love Thomas the Tank Engine, this combines everything together. With wonderful character, nostalgia, an intense story, a heroic heart-pulling adventure, fantastic scenery, stellar music, and everything in between. This is the peak for classic Thomas. The absolute best episode. Between narrators, Ringo had great moments of emotion.
I've done it, we're off! I've done it, we're off!
George had great moments of voice and emotion.
Positively painful, remarked James. Just pathetic, grunted Gordon. He should give up and be preserved before it's too late. Shut up, burst out Duck.
For the Bill and Ben segment of the episode, the two are matched. Since Edward's journey is the best moment of the franchise, let's examine the two dubs there. Some might say George Carlin is being lazy and putting no emotion into it. To that I say, listen to the episode again. For moments like when the train finally started up, it's very clear George isn't bored. He's being ominous. All throughout the segment of Edward in trouble, George Carlin gives this tone of mystery and danger. That's something he never did quite at this length in any episode before or since. He knew this was an intense moment. Ringo played this line louder.
Suddenly, Edward's wheels slipped fiercely. With a shrieking crack, something broke.
But George is playing it forebodingly, as if this is a very serious moment.
Suddenly, Edward's wheels slipped fiercely, and with a shrieking crack, something broke.
Both get the driver's line about the crank pins as good as the other. However, bringing the best moment of the franchise under high scrutiny, Ringo's narration doesn't seem to hit the same moments quite right.
On the way, the weather changed. His sanding gear failed, and his fireman rode in front, dropping sand on the rails by hand. That will be much easier, said Edward. Well done, boy.
George hits the emotion quite nicely.
On the way, the weather changed. His sanding gear failed, and his fireman rode in front, dropping sand on the rails by hand. Come on, he puffed. Steady, boy, warned his driver. Well done, boy. You've got them. You've got them.
In addition, George's more pleasant voice suits plenty of places like the line about Edward arriving at last better. Ghost Train, or Percy's ghostly trick. This one is a landmark episode. It continues Thomas and Percy's bantering friendship, which is really fun. But the biggest accomplishment of this episode was that they took the story from the book and added so much of a spooky atmosphere to it. Scary episodes continue through the classic series, especially during Season 5, and this one was where it all began. Right from the very first scene, it started the spooky theme with extremely haunting music and a brilliant set as Percy told the story. All throughout the episode, even when we're at the quarry just talking, the fog keeps the atmosphere going. Then during Percy's night run, it is so eerie with the twisted trees, and even that windmill feels spooky. The music also never lets up the atmosphere, from the quiet scenes to the crash. I love also that Toby agrees to help Percy scare the pants off Thomas, and the whole bit telling him what happened to Percy is really good. Then Percy comes to the shed with a very spooky voice, and plays the part very well. They succeed in scaring Thomas for a whole night, and even next morning he is panicked. That line, "Gotta see a coach about a train," is really funny. And who can blame Thomas? Never before or since has Percy's whistle been so scary. This episode is both a great spooky episode of the Season 5 type, and a really fun classic story that fits into the first 4 seasons. The best of both worlds. The narrations on this episode are both spectacular. Both Ringo and George do a great job soaking up the eeriness and intense moments too.
Plunging into the gap.
Shrieking like a lost soul. Oh, it makes my wheels wobble to think of it.
Crow's Farm Crossing. We shan't be long now.
But a broken cartload of lime lay ahead.
Sam the farmer had just gone for help.
Let me in! Let me in!
Both are just so well done on spookiness, character, and everything. I must say this one is a tie. Both Ringo's UK dub and George's dub are so good and so different. Listen to both. Ringo's US dub only has 2 dialogue changes, one of which omits the TV line, which is a drawback, but something else happened to that narration. The audio has shifted. The background noises are now louder and deeper than the dialogue. I guess if you want the owl from the opening to be a lot spookier. but most of the time during the episode it enhances the puffing sound effects, which I don't need to hear louder. And during the opening and shed scenes, it takes the echo off Ringo's voice, which takes away a lot of the fun of the story, so avoid Ringo's US dub. The other two are awesome. Woolly Bear. This episode was my least favorite for a while. After Thomas found out Percy's ghost was a trick, he was very rude to Percy. Though rather than the usual jokes the two friends play on each other, Thomas goes personal and calls Percy an ugly caterpillar. He's boasting about needing to be on time, but calling your best friend ugly on multiple occasions and humiliating him in front of others felt too mean when I was younger. And it probably is. Even in the books, Audrey knew this was further than Thomas's character usually goes, and made note of it in the opening letter. And this was from the last book in the Railway series, so this is where his character development was going to end. What a shame. In the TV series, they do it better by having him slowly become better in the 3rd to 5th seasons. So in the context of the TV series only, this is an important episode for Thomas's progression. Between narrators, George and Ringo, as far as emotion and energy, are tied on this episode.
Whee!
Whee!
They both do this argument well.
Your ugly fizz is enough to frighten anyone.
Ugly indeed. I'm green caterpillar with red stripes.
George was a little better with timing on that one. Both did this line well.
The wind was blowing fiercely. Look at that!
The wind was blowing fiercely. Look at that!
And both did Thomas's complaining well.
10 minutes late. I warned him.
Passengers will complain and the fat controller.
There are some lines Ringo does better.
Tossing it up and over the track. Thomas seethed impatiently.
And some George does better.
Time after time. Look what's crawled out of the hay.
But the one deciding point for me is George's voices for Percy and the driver.
Everyone says I'm handsome. Take a run at it, Percy.
Still, if you prefer Ringo's narration, it's pretty good.
Sorry I'm late.
Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree. As the concluding episode of Season 2, this continues the trend of being a Christmas special. This has been called one of the great Christmas episodes of the series, not necessarily for its story, but for its visuals. And I have to agree. The Thomas Christmas specials from this era aren't really heartwarming, magical, life-changing stories. They're nice, pleasant Christmas tales. Nothing wrong with that, but they're not the greatest things in the world. Some of the later CGI episodes break that trend, but in the classic series, they're just good old Christmas stories with Thomas. Having said all that, I do think this is a better Christmas special story-wise than last season's, and it has fantastic aesthetics. I love all the many snow sets, the frozen watermill and the evening shots. The snow avalanche looks really impressive, and when Thomas wheeshes off the snow, that looks good. This episode and the Deputation make the only two snow episodes of the season, and this one I think took advantage of it a little more with all the different environments and lights. It looks fantastic. The story I do think is a pretty good one with a rescue. Donald and Douglas save Thomas from an avalanche just in time for the caroling. As the engines mentioned, they wanted to do again, like last season. And I must say the very last scene is definitely my favorite. The engines get their wish and begin the caroling. The lights come on like last time, and the Christmas decorations look great. You see that everyone is there wearing hats like last time. Every engine character who was in the show up to that point is there, even Diesel, who's supposed to be gone. This was the big Christmas party gathering where the whole family came together. Then you get excited when Harold's theme plays, he lands, and turns out he brought Santa Claus with him. Then with the music from last season's song playing, the episode ends on an absolutely perfect note. The first thing I'll say about narration was I discovered when listening to the episode that in Ringo's US dub, he didn't re-record anything. Instead, lines that mention the fat controller were edited out, which is the only Thomas episode to ever do that. And it sounds rather strange when 15-second gaps come because of that. Concerning Ringo's UK dub, strangely, it's the same thing as last season's Christmas finale. He's a lot more monotone than George.
It was 2 days before Christmas. I mustn't be late, he thought. Suddenly there was a strange whirring sound. Percy and Toby smiled. They knew who it was. "It's no fun getting stuck in the snow," whispered Thomas to Percy, "but it was worth it for this party."
Odd, since he has been better this season. He does have a good line here.
Thomas tried to move, but he couldn't.
And he does have a couple cool voice tricks.
"Probably the wind," said Douglas. "Help. 1, 2, 3.
But he can't compete. George has the Sir Topham Hatt voice, Donald and Douglas's voice, and is giving more emotion.
Our Christmas tree has arrived just in time. Come on, the poor wee engine must be frozen to the frames in there. Suddenly, like magic, the station was flooded with lights, bringing the greatest surprise of all, Santa Claus. Everyone cheered and the party began.
Season 2 was another really great season that wonderfully complemented the first as well as the Railway series. Since I said every one of the first 8 has a distinct look, this season's general look is more brown, more industrial, more dirty. And I don't mind it at all. I think it adds to the charm of making the model world feel like a real railway. I dare say I prefer this over the first season's aesthetic. In narration, George was doing as great as ever, and Ringo Starr did improve over last season. Although my score for him came out with fewer wins than Season 1 had a lot more easy wins for George. And here Ringo brought some good competition. Aside from the very last one, he never had an episode that felt stale. And since I've reached the end of his run, my opinion on him overall? I liked his work. I think when he brought out energy, which was more particularly in the second season, he gave a lot of great moments to the series. Also, the sound of his voice, so long as he wasn't being monotone, is nice to listen to. I think this whole season is even better than the last one. For a time I considered this one to be the best season of them all, against popular opinion that honor goes to Season 4. Now, I'd ask you all, what do you think? It could be. It has some very favorite stories, Donald and Douglas, the Diseasel, the Duck and Diesel trilogy, Edward's Exploit, Ghost Train, and many others. But whichever one is best, this season was stellar. Thomas the Tank Engine had exploded in popularity and established itself as a very well-loved kids show just 2 seasons in. It's interesting to note this season could have been the last, as they had gone through the whole Railway series all the way to the last book, Tramway Engines, with Woolly Bear, though they had adapted less than half of the Railway series stories. Since production values always needed to be considered, it wasn't until 5 years later that the series came back with enough money to adapt more stories. In the meantime, many of the crew, including director David Mitton, went to work on another project.